For the lead in, yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. The lead in, 173 people scored 22.95, could talk about unit tests and know it's about writing a test first, then making a pass, not refactoring. 5.32% of that 173 could talk well about TDD, but not feel comfortable working with tests, and said it really doesn't work in the real world. And only about 1.64% demonstrated they could do something close to Red-Green-Refactor and want to do it. There, that was a quick synopsis.
Perfect.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that takes us to the topic, which is, I think we're probably teaching TDD wrong. And I have a few opinions on this, and hopefully we'll be able to dive into various side conversations around this space. You always see the presentation. That works. Yes?
Yep.
Okay. So quick disclaimer, Comcast occasionally does bad things to me. If that happens, I'll be back momentarily, but it hasn't happened this morning, so fingers crossed on that. So my name is Matt Plavcan. For those of you who haven't met me before, I live in Portland, Oregon, been here for about 25 years. I moved originally here to work for a little company called Intel. So my background originally is in hardware engineering, moved into software and software coaching fairly soon after. I've been a CTO for a startup. I have delivered production code using test-driven development. And I spend a lot of time these days coaching as a freelance coach teams and organizations on how to act in their own self-interest to deliver code better. My individual organization's testing focus, I've worked with a number of organizations, including Industrial Logic in the past, and will do so again in the future. So usually as a coach, you end up approaching an organization and we immediately come in and start having conversations with people and immediately say, yes, of course, we want to be agile, we want to have all the possible improvements we can possibly do. And in some cases, we have organizations come in and say, yes, we definitely have been doing agile. We've got this nailed, no problem. We just need a few things from you. And inevitably, this comes down to me saying, oh, great, that's perfect. You do agile? Yes. We do the scrums. So TDD? Yes, we do the scrums. And then we have a question about what is your practice plan? And I get this blank stare from people. And I say, what is your practice plan? Because very few companies actually allocate time for teams to practice. And this is surprising given the number of things that we talked about. The one skill we talked earlier about giving life advice in our preamble this morning, about life advice to kids. Like, what do you need? Well, you need to have learning skills. Organizations, there are two types. There are organizations that learn and there are organizations that perish. And we like to be usually in the first ones because those tend to get paid. So with the constant learning being a prerequisite for growth and advancement, not only in your career, but in your corporate market position and income, it's a surprise to me that how few companies actually dedicate their time to this. It's often pushed on the employees, or occasionally they'll bring in some coaches for some focus time. And that usually involves ending up with a coach and a group of people in a space, which we have something that looks like this. If we're lucky, we get, some teams have 20% time. We'll have groups that will set aside some time for training, or they'll set aside some dedicated practice time. And in my advice, in my space for companies, I recommend 20%. And inevitably that ends up negotiated down to a smaller number. And it's, a fight to keep that space and that time pure for people to actually be able to practice something. And I keep focusing and saying practice over learning because I view those as two very different things. And that's one of the first kind of key points I want to talk about. When we look at what something like test-driven development, we look at it sometimes through a lens of learning, but we don't look at it through the lens of practice. And those two things have a very different way of how we reinforce our knowledge and how we reinforce our ability to perform those tasks. So today I want to talk a little bit about mental models for learning. I'm going to talk about building habits and some of the steps that we do to take on that challenge. And then I'm going to propose that the way we're teaching TDD right now, and in fact, the default mental model that we show is an awkward way to adopt TDD. And there is potentially an alternate way for us to go and look at it. And in fact, it's not that the model we have is broken, it's just awkward for initial learning. And it might be one of the stumbling blocks that we can try to work around and bring more people into the fold. So we have more people doing TDD and doing TDD better, faster. So the format for this is, by the way, I assume if nobody's asked a question at some point, or if nobody's typed a question into the chat within about 5 or 10 minutes, everyone's fallen asleep. So please, by all means, keep it engaged. Steve, if there's some good questions come up, if you can moderate, and we'll try to get those in, in a timely fashion with the material that's going on. If we need to put something in the parking lot for later, I'm happy to do that as well. So we bring this team together and we're going to introduce this brand new thing called TDD, except they've all heard about TDD before, and they've heard a lot of different things. And so when we get them together, they're imagining, what does TDD look like? What flavor of TDD are we going to get? How is TDD going to be? And inevitably, there's somebody who ends up with, I had a bad TDD experience. For those of you who don't recognize this fruit, this is known as durian. It is extremely tough. It requires a machete to get into. It is very, very dangerous. If it drops off the tree, it can very much kill you. It has the scent of kind of rotted sewage, old socks, and has a taste that's a cross between green apple, onion, and kind of a texture of overripe tomato. It is delicious. I love it. However, it is banned in hotels due to the smell, and it is usually used as a hazing ritual for in Southeast Asia for your Western coworkers. It is amazing, but getting past the rind and getting into the actual fruit is a bad experience. And this is the challenge of, did we prime ourselves for this experience? Did we set it up correctly? Or did we just kind of get in there and say, here, grab this, try this, you're going to love it. And then they had the bad experience. And, I'm sure we can draw other parallels in life. Everyone's probably had a bad alcohol experience at one point, usually in college, that, I'll never X again. Many people, I will never durian ever, or I will never durian again. So to get past this, we have to think about the setting and the way we present this. And when we do this, we want to look at what type of learning are we doing. And so I have a particular mental model where I separate learning into 3 categories. If we're going to be spending time doing software, it tends to fall into 3 different buckets, if you will. First and foremost is the problem, the thing we're actually trying to do in the business. So product problems. And these are things like our domain abstractions, the business logic, the architecture, the actual things that we get paid money to do on software teams when we deliver something. The second 2 categories are supporting to that goal. And one is tools and technology. And this is the things that we usually see on resumes. Do you know this language? Are you familiar with this framework? Do you have sufficient knowledge of these various patterns? Did you have a degree in your schooling that did these things, or whatever type of training? These are the things that tend to be listed as static skills, and there's an assumption that they're at least competent moving into it. And this includes things like knowing how to use a computer. Can you actually use your IDE? And surprisingly, a lot of those things end up being learned on the job. And last but not least, we have behaviors, which is all the things that I want to focus on during this conversation, which these are things that aren't necessarily something that you can learn by listening to a presentation. They aren't things that you can learn by watching a podcast. They aren't things that you can learn by any other way except really by doing. So example of this, touch typing. You will not become a better typist by watching a YouTube video. You actually have to type some characters. Pairing and mobbing, communication skills, working with people. You have to be able to do those things with other people and to become good at it. Get that feedback, that live action from interacting with people. Continuous integration is also a habit. The idea of actually pulling from main and actually incorporating other people's changes and being willing to stomach that the potential for conflict in your code and taking that responsibility on yourself is a habit, because it's one of those things where you know what it is, it's right to do, but there's still incentives and feedback mechanisms that dissuade people from taking it on. And test-driven development has a very tight set of habits that are connected. And so it's not just learning. TDD, there's a huge amount of learning behind that, and we'll hit that in a second, but there's also a core set of tight habits that are required in order to be fluent in TDD. And the thing about these is each of these three different learnings categories can be done together, but when you do, it dilutes the learning in any of them. So when I look at this, I typically look at this as an axis. I think of each of them on a separate orthogonal axis. So if I want to work on technology, if I want to learn a new language, I'm not also going to select a new problem I've never heard of, and I'm not going to try TDD for the first time, because then I won't understand any of it. So I'll try to constrain one of those axes. So, and this is very obvious when you work on code kata, or when you work in, for instance, a Code Dojo setting. We're working on a code kata, so it's a known problem, a very small scope problem, so we don't have all of our business concerns distracting us from the technology or the behavior we're trying to learn. If I know TDD and I have a well-known problem, let's say game of life, then in an iteration of Code Dojo or Code Retreat, I can learn a brand new language. I can work with somebody and I can get feedback from them, help them guide me through the nuances of a new language. And I can map that to my existing knowledge of a language that I'm already more comfortable with. I commonly say I'm equally bad in all languages. I'm happy to dive into any of them because I'm usually comfortable in both the problem and behavior domain enough that I can pull that off. But it takes having that solid base in the behavior. So each one of these axes that are less constrained or come loose, the more likely we are to have less learning on the thing we're trying to focus on. And that's really important, because really when we want to maximize the problem axis, that usually is actual work from our various day-to-day production code. And we want technology and behavior to be constrained, and that we understand the languages and the tools we're using, and we understand how to do things, or we have a set of behaviors fluently backing ourselves up so we can focus solely on the problem and everything else stays in the background. Steve, I'm seeing a few things pop in the chat. Any questions that you want to pull in? Okay, keep going.
Nope, you're good.
Okay, great. So just backing up for the slide for a second, problems and technology tend to be cognitive problems. They're things that are driven where you can watch a YouTube video about design patterns and you can learn about design patterns. You still need to get practice in them, but there are things that fundamentally you can gain a lot of knowledge through non-practice consumption or non-practice learning. Technology and tools the same way. There are guides and manuals out there. There's still value in practicing them, but a lot of them are going to still be more about what you know than what you do. I would argue that IDE very quickly gets into the behavior category, because at that point, knowing your keystrokes and being able to quickly move your hands from place to place without having to think about where it is, you're starting to get into that behavior spot. So technology tends to blend a little bit, because especially in the user interface category. But by the time we get down to things like in the habit category, we're definitely in the practice or you won't get any learning bucket. So in the cognitive space, we have this idea of there's actually a hierarchy. I don't know if a quick show of hands, Bloom's taxonomy. Have people heard of this before? So Bloom's taxonomy, there are 3 different domains. And the one that's most well known is the cognitive learning one. And I got really lucky. I had a teacher in my 4th grade and 5th grade classes who taught me this. This is me winning the lottery, because I had a teacher who understood this and really was able to literally gave homework, again, to an elementary school class about, are you doing work at this level? And so Bloom's taxonomy is really cool. For those of you who are familiar with it, I'm going to walk through it. It's a 6-part hierarchy. I am using the ancient version of it that came out in the 50s and 60s. They've done a little swapping. I'll get to that in a second. So this is built up like a hierarchy. Things at the bottom support things at the top. However, when you're working and thinking, you tend to jump between levels, which is to say, one, do I know something? Okay, do I know that there is such a thing as a unit test? A unit test exists. Do I know what a unit test is? Then we have understanding or comprehension. Do I understand what a unit test does? Do I understand what it's for? Can I explain to somebody what it should use? It's going back to Steve's, I think it was 5%, or maybe 25%. Yeah, so 25% actually could say, okay, yes, we actually know what a unit test is, and we can describe what it's useful for, but that's where it ends. The next level up is application. Can you take that knowledge and actually put it to use? And so maybe you can write a unit test at that point. And at application level, we start to get a little bit of locking in some practice. So application at this point, we can take all of our book knowledge and start translating that into actionable, productive work. And then the upper levels start to get into the situation of how do we correlate our knowledge with other pieces of knowledge. So looking at this, is this a good unit test? What are the categories of a good unit test? How do we write a unit test that has a single assertion, that has high defect locality, that is insensitive to implementation changes? What are the categories of things? So that's analysis. Can we then create new categories of things? That's in the synthesis category. And in the modern flavor, synthesis has actually been moved above evaluation. Evaluation is, can I take 2 unit tests and compare? Which one would I rather like? What is the next one to write? What's a better one to write? How do I make those trade-offs? And so you get into this now system of values, and it takes a much more comprehensive understanding of both not only what do you know, what have you applied, and what is your learned experience feeding into that decision tree. So Bloom's taxonomy for cognitive learning is really a really good model for things that we know and things that we can do, but it's a slow path. If we were thinking about, for instance, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow book, this is in most cases, the slow path. These are things that we know, and it takes a long time to acquire that knowledge, but it also is a very slow application. And the result of that is it's very useful, but at the same time, in the moment, if you don't have it, it takes a long time to acquire. And so if we look at things in TDD, what are some good cognitive skills? Well, writing good unit tests, writing the minimal code, for instance, writing a naive implementation or doing the fake it till you make it case, as we sometimes call it. Knowing what test to write next, that evaluation or analysis skill. Things like triangulation. How do we use multiple tests to dial in to the right combination of production code? And how do we use that to give us hints on what we should refactor to? Or how do we arrange it so we write the most valuable tests first? Do we know what the edge cases are? Can we save those till later? A good example of this is James Grenning's zombies rubric, which is write the 0 case first. Just make the test pass, right? The naive implementation. Make it work for one case. Make it work for many cases. Work on boundaries, interfaces, exceptions, and other special cases. So the idea of all these things, those are all in the cognitive space. And I would say refactoring patterns also sit in that. There's a huge, huge catalog of refactoring patterns, and it is fundamentally a cognitive space, but it's going to come back to us in habits in a moment. I'll point out that in a second, because when do we do these things are all the in the moment habits. So do you run your tests regularly? If you're lucky, you've installed something that does it for you. Every time you save, every time you edit, every time you commit, you've got something that's running your tests for you. But if not, you need that habit of your idle finger stroke should be run the tests, run the tests. Unfortunately, my idle finger strokes I discovered, and I've been working on breaking this habit, is RM-RF. I found that out very, very quickly in high school, and it had some good failure stories associated with it. But it's even today, I still notice that that's in my habits. For some reason, my fingers like typing that at a prompt. So Git is now my friend forever. So writing your tests regularly, knowing when to write a test, knowing when to refactor, knowing when we should commit our code or reintegrate our code. All of those things are things that we want to be cued. We want to have a signal where we automatically perform that action, or we perform that action intrinsically. If we have to think about it, there's usually too many other things going on, too much noise in our environment, noise in our team, noise in the system, noise in our heads that keep us from doing that. So we need to build habits around these things to support a framework where we can apply our cognitive skills. So we let those habits drive us, and we let the cognitive skills be our focus as we're working on the slower path. And there's no short circuit to getting the fast path done. If we discover that any of those things are actually something we're not fluent in, it becomes friction that prevents us from getting to the cognitive skills.
Matt?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I absolutely love what you're talking about with this, because, you know, I call it, you know, mastery or automaticity. When you learn something to the level of automaticity, or what you're talking about, making it a habit, you actually have different, your brain works differently when you're doing that thing. The example that I'm sure most of us can appreciate is, has anyone here ever had an epiphany about stuff you were doing the previous day when you're in the shower showering, or on your commute to and from work, if you're still commuting to and from work? Those things that you do automatically, your brain actually switches into a different mode and starts thinking about it. Is that what you're trying to get at, Matt?
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of your routine are already built in habits. And I challenge people, obviously we're all virtual right now, but think about your drive to work. Do you remember your drive to work? Mm-hmm. Do you remember what you did when you went into the bathroom this morning? Yeah. Do you remember the entire sequence? Are you sure that was today? Because most of that is all habit driven. A lot of our brains run on these loops. In fact, it's an energy saving factor in human design, right? That is the thing. We're all about saving energy and having to think about these things. And the habits are a mechanism that our brains use to keep us from expending energy on trivial things. So it's exactly that. Yes, and we want that automaticity. Or how would you describe it? Is that
automaticity?
Automaticity. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a whole separate way of learning behavioral things. And so Bloom's taxonomy, there's three categories. There's the cognitive, there's an emotional one, which we won't discuss today, and there's what they call psychomotor. And so psychomotor skills are usually associated with things that are physically related. And it just so happens that these days, all of my hobbies and all of my after hours activities happen to also be physical activities where I'm coaching. So I now am coaching in two physical domains. And a lot of that has actually carried and influenced the way I teach people to write software now. It turns out that the coaching in a lot of different domains gives you some interesting insight across those domains and gives you some additional strategies for trying new things. So psychomotor learning is more of a hierarchy than cognitive learning. It is very, very, very difficult to jump right to origination and then jump back down to perception. A lot of these things really do build on each other and are required to get to the next level. So if you do discover that you're jumping between levels, what that really indicates is you're doing multiple things at the same time, and some of your habits have different levels of fluency. And we'll talk about competing habits a little bit later. So first base level of this is set. Oh, sorry, it's perception. The idea that I see that something's about to happen. So I see a ball has been thrown at me and I raise my glove to catch it. I see that there's a yellow light and I might need to do something. What I need to do isn't necessarily obvious yet, but I see the yellow light. So when we're building a habit, we want to isolate as much as possible that condition so we get strong feedback. We want to increase our signal to noise ratio. So this is a good reason why things like Code Dojos and Code Retreats and things like that, that isolate the group by bringing them out of your environment, bringing you out of your work environment into a more focused forum, help you isolate those signals and bring things together. So it gives us that perception. We also want to call attention to things when they happen. So this is where the wisdom of the group of mobs also comes in, because often you will have somebody in the group that might miss one of these cues. And it turns out that as a group, you're more sensitive to the cues. Everybody self-reinforces and makes stronger feedback on that observation. All right, following that is set. Set is a number of different things. It's the emotional set, it's the mindset, it's the physical set of knowing what you're about to do. And this is a challenge because a lot of times I see people being instructed or coached blindly, as in go do this thing, don't ask questions about it and just assume. And there are some times when that's an appropriate instruction, but if you've given somebody no instructions about what they need to do and you're trying to build a habit, they get a conflicting set of signals and a lot of panic. And so we really do a lot of damage to the learning process when we don't prime somebody for when this happens, we're going to do this thing. A good example of this, as this was, we had a driving instructor who asked a driver who was at a high performance driving event to pass another car. The driver who was driving a manual only knew that usually when they passed another car, they downshifted. This works on the highway when you are not at the rev limiter. When you do this on the straightaway, you lock up the tires, spin the car, and crash into the wall, which is exactly what they did. So there was an assumption that by the instructor that the student knew what to do when they asked them to pass the car and had not given them any more specific instructions. And the result of that was not only an injury and a lot of damage, but it was, could have been a much worse situation. Obviously, in the physical domain, we have a lot more worry about safety, but there's an element of psychological safety here. People start to feel really vulnerable when you're asking them to do things they don't know how to do. So before you ask somebody to do something, say, hey, we're about to see this, and when we see this, we're going to do that. So we start to set up the pattern for what we're about to do, and it's good sometimes to explain what the outcome will be. Then we get to the guided response. We're going to lead them through a guided exercise. This is where we will tell them exactly what we're doing as we do it. In the military, there's the phrase, tell them what you're about to tell them what you're telling them, tell them what you told them. Guided response. And it's important in this situation to follow the action all the way through. If we're in a situation where it's like, and we would do this, unless it's absolutely necessary for safety reasons, following through is really important, because if somebody gets in the habit of going halfway, they will go halfway every time. We have this problem when we're teaching people to throw in judo. If we teach them to pick the person up, but never actually get them off their feet, they will come in and freeze. When it comes time for them to actually throw somebody, they will come in and freeze. Surprisingly, that doesn't work to throw somebody. Not surprisingly, that does make them a good target for a counterattack. So try to follow the action all the way through when you're doing this. Don't cut the action short. One of the challenges with this is sometimes our actions and the things we're building as habits are a complex set of maneuvers. So decomposition and being able to break this into intermediate steps with a solid link to the next step is essential. The mechanism. Now we do it over and over and over again. You've guided them through it. They know what to do. We repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And we build that so that their action becomes a routine. Right? So the cue results in an action. The action then becomes a routine. And then we have a feedback mechanism that lets them know what's going on. Good job. So this gets us into the space where with those 4 levels, with lots and lots and lots of repetition, we build a habit. those 4 steps get us to the habit. And once we do that, now we can start to do some interesting things. Now the next steps are all fluency. We can now combine those in interesting ways. We can create new ones. We can, use them in new contexts, or even build something that is outside of the normal scope. So this is in the space of, for those people who think about shu-ha-ri, all up until habit, we're still in the shu category, right? Follow the rule. Once we get into complex overt response adaptation, now we're into ha, break the rule. And then we get to origination, do something new, be the rule. So we have a very, again, some of the things we already talk about. You hear shu-ha-ri as I mentioned, those are Japanese words that more or less mean those things. You hear those in software circles. You see those in a lot of trainings. This is what they're connecting to. They're connecting to the habit cycle. But we often still bring that back to the cognitive cycle. And we think about a cognitive domain. And I think we do ourselves a disservice there because we do miss out on that practice and that repetition mechanism. One thing that I have added as a personal rule, and I think is extremely important, and I haven't found this described the same way everywhere, but one of the key things I try to do is do not create a behavior that you later want to contradict, because then you have to reset and build from the bottom. So if I build a behavior, I want to decompose it enough that it will stand on its own for the remainder of that person's experience of it. And that can be a challenge. But if I create a behavior that has to be unlearned, now I've given them an additional challenge where now they're going to be fighting themselves to learn the new thing. And especially if it's to reach a higher capability. And I see this in TDD a lot, where we learn toy problems really well, and then we can't get to the higher capability. And sometimes it's the way we learn TDD that's standing in our way. So since we're talking about habits, the go-to book on this is Charles Duhigg's book, Power of Habit. He simplifies this. He doesn't go through the whole Bloom's taxonomy. He says there are 3 steps in building a habit. There's a cue, there's a routine, and there's a reward. We didn't talk too much about the reward earlier, but this is the important part. There needs to be a payoff at the end of this for you to continue this habit. So you must have something, a cue, a set of circumstances, that's our perception and set again, to do a routine, our guided response that becomes a mechanism that becomes repeatable. But then at the end, there has to be cake. There must be punch and pie, right? There has to be something that pays off the reward, or so it pays off the overall habit. Otherwise, the habit won't repeat. And the trick for this then is the reward then builds demand for the cue. So once you have the cue, the routine, the reward, you savor the cue again. You can't wait until you get the next cue. And this is also how addiction loops get built. And it'd be really nice if we could start addicting programmers to TDD.
Matt, there's a question. How does the guided response look like, or how does the guided response look like in teaching TDD, or what does that look like?
Good question. So with TDD, there's 2 backup skills that I think are really important. One is writing a good unit test. So that piece of cognitive skill is a foundational piece to help the guided response. So in the idea of not asking somebody to do something they don't know how to do, if you throw somebody into a TDD loop and you don't have good unit test writing skills, or you've never written a good unit test before, you can't have somebody guide them through, that piece ends up being very, very difficult. The second piece is identifying the individual, I would say I decompose to identify the individual cues along the way, so that each guided response is a short piece. So writing the test is one short guided response, and then decomposing, writing the failing test and writing the production code are separate habits and separate responses. So you can really do that, focus on that particular cognitive skill and connect it to the cue. So what we're really talking about here now is a behavioral state machine. So we're going to ignore for a moment the return from reward to queue as long as we get the right reward. And we'll talk about rewards more. What we have is a behavioral state machine. So given a queue, when I do this routine, then I get the reward. If I'm a hamster, when I press the button, then I get the pellet. Right? And hopefully we're not generating Skinner boxes. We want this to be a predictable behavior loop, because if we generate random responses, if when I do this, then I might get this, it leads to some really erratic behavior. People will throw themselves at things over and over again. That's part of the danger of things like gambling. The idea of, and in fact, you see this in some of the video games these days too. Hey, it's a loot crate. I open it up. I get something great. That's great. I open the loot crate. There's nothing. What do? I open up another loot crate because I'm going to keep pulling the handle on that one-armed bandit until I get something better. And we see, from the habit book, there's a description of, it turns out that people who are addicted to gambling see see near misses differently than people who aren't addicted. And so for that, we actually do want to kind of really focus on what rewards we're giving people for TDD. And it's a shame Ted can't join us this time. I'll mention that the rewards for testing are really essential to driving that feedback loop.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Have you read the book Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg?
I have not. Please add a link to the list.
Yes, it's a wonderful book, and it's about making that feedback loop even smaller. So it's like, hey, you thought about doing TDD before you wrote that code. Yay! You did that. It's about getting those feedback loops and making really small feedback loops to improve the behavior that you want to build. So, yeah.
Yep. Cool. So I'm going to represent it this way. I'm going to represent the queue and the reward without the feedback loop from the reward back to the queue. Let's just assume it's there. It's going to make our diagrams a little bit nicer, because I'm going to go into next I'm going to go into, now we talked about behavioral state machines. We talked about queue and reward, queue routine reward. Now I want to talk about what's the default model for TDD? Everybody, what is the default model for teaching TDD? 3 words. You do a search for TDD, this is what you get in your search. Everybody has red-green-refactor, with some variation of arrows and some different state machines. Some people do some interesting state machines, like did the test pass? They're actually doing little micro steps in between. Okay, if so, go back this way. Okay, did I actually do what I expected to do? Okay, go that way. So I'm an outer loop for acceptance test from development. I write an acceptance test on the outer loop, and then I do micro tests on the insert loop to get my unit test, TDD loop, and then I get back out. And so a lot of these tend to be in that same space. But let's look at the general Red-Green-Refactor, because that is the default model. These are all flavors, even though that some have 5 states, some have 4 states, some have 7 states. They all end up being some flavor of Red-Green-Refactor, which is our predominant mental model for it. I realized many years ago, I stopped teaching people Red-Green-Refactor. I was still teaching them TDD, but I stopped using this as the model, and I started to think about it. Why was I doing that? And I found the problem is it's a really imprecise state machine, and the engineer in me hates that. But it also means if I can't identify what the states and what the actions are, then I don't actually understand what the behaviors are. And that makes it really difficult to describe to somebody else. So let me try to clarify this. There are 2 options for this. So we have writing a failing test, right? So we write the test and then tests fail. Those are 2 different things. We write the code and the tests pass. Those are 2 different things. And we refactor and the test pass. So we have actually 6 different things. 3 of them are actions and 3 of them are states. So that means we have 2 options. On the left, we can make the test suite passing as the action that advances our state machine. So when we refactor, or given we refactor, when the test suite passes, then we will go write the test. when we write the test, or given we run the test, when the new test fails, then we will write the code. Alternately, we can have a model that says, hey, when we write a failing test, then the test will fail. When, given the tests have failed, when we write production code, then the test will pass. One of those feels a little bit more natural to me, but it also happens to align with the language we use. When we talk about going red or going green, are we talking about writing the test, or are we talking about the test suite?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the test suite. Are you green? Right? You hear people say that. Where are we? Are we green? We're green. Okay. We're not talking about writing the test to make the test pass. We're talking about the state of the test suite. So there's a natural alignment between using the state of the test suite for the state machine, and then the actions are the things we're actually acting on, which is nice. There's just one little awkward thing. Our refactor code goes from pass to pass. And that's interesting, because that's a really hard habit. If we're passing before and passing after, there's some weirdness there. But that's even worse for another reason. And this is why I think this model is difficult to learn. We have to go through all three cycles, all three states, in order to get a feedback loop, in order to get to make progress. And worse, when we're first writing our first tests, how often do we stop in the refactor state? Well, not a lot, right? Unless we're writing a kata that really emphasizes refactoring, we're more likely to just be in this loop where we just go right to writing the failing test. And in this context, that means the decision, going through the decision of whether to refactor, is now slow thinking. It slows down, it breaks our flow. That decision is a slow decision mechanism right now. It's not a habit. It ends up being an actual cognitive decision that we're spending time actually using brain power. And that really impedes our learning process. So this works, but it only works in certain circumstances. And that's a problem, because this violates my principle. Don't create a behavior that you have to unlearn to get to a higher capability. So this is the thing that broke me. This is why I stopped teaching Red-Green-Refactor in this particular form, because it only works if you already know how to do TDD to go through that quickly. You can do it. You can learn this way, but it ends up, my experiments with this, where I've worked with people, it shows it is a slow process. People end up trying to ask themselves, what should I refactor? Is it the right time to refactor? Oh, wait a minute. I don't even know how to refactor in some cases. There's a whole other set of cognitive skills on top of that, in terms of knowing how to refactor and knowing why to refactor, that now are impeding our ability to do a fast feedback loop around test first code. By the way, when I teach test-driven development, the very first session, I tell people I've lied to them. I brought them in there to teach them test-driven development, and at the end of the day, they only know how to do test first. Because as it turns out, all the studies around habits say it takes somewhere in the order of 6 to 10 weeks to learn a new habit. So if you learn test first and you practice test first for 6 to 10 weeks with the appropriate feedback and coaching, yes, now you'll be doing test-driven development. But at the end of the day, you'll be doing test first development. And that's still much, much better than you were before. So yay, like immediate endorphin feedback, you're going to be amazing, because at least you have a set of tests to back up your code, and you have written some pretty minimal code to make it pass. So I cut out refactoring altogether. And it's worth noting that actually one of the discussions we have as coaches is, hey, do we teach refactoring first? Do we teach TDD first? That's not really part of this discussion, but I'll just say right now, I teach refactoring first. I find it's a much easier set of skills and much more applicable, though it ends up being fairly dangerous if people don't have a good set of tests behind them. But also, I like the fact that TDD isn't really about tests, it's about design, and people tend to have existing designs. And so refactoring ends up being a more useful skill for them. So if we cut this out, we end up with a tiny, tiny little TDD focus loop with two behaviors. Very simple behaviors. Given all tests are passing, when we write a new test, then that test fails. Yay, the test fails. And this is where Ted would say, when we write a new test, then we predict whether the test will fail and how it will fail or why it will fail. and then that test fails. And I think that is an essential piece. That is building in the reward system for failing tests. The fact that a test is going red is normally a bad thing if you're a testing group. Despite decades of knowledge, Doug Clark from DEC back in the early 70s said, each failing test should be a cause for celebration because we learn one more thing about the nature of our design.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, we still treat failing tests as a disaster. We shouldn't. We should celebrate failure. So I like the fact, especially if you play Ted's TDD game, pitch for Ted since he's not here. The idea that you predict why the test will fail. I think the test will fail because we haven't implemented that code yet, so it's going to fail compile. I think that test that we just wrote is about to fail because we return a fixed naive value of 1, and this is asking for something that will return a value other than 1. So I expect it'll be 2 when we ask for 1, or something like that. So that feedback loop about predicting behavior, one, it engages the engineer's brain, right? It really does say, hey, look, we're trying to understand the code. It starts to embed that learning, but it also gives them a quick check. Hey, I think it's going to fail because of this. Run the test. Hey, it failed. Yes, we win. That endorphin rush right there is that excitement that reinforces the failing test habit. Then we have the complementary habit. Let's make the code pass. Okay, a test is failing. That's a challenge to us. The Q is a challenge, right? But more importantly, because we wrote a very good test, leaning on our cognitive knowledge of how to write a good unit test, that unit test is very specific about how it wants us to make that test pass. And now we can leverage that cognitive knowledge with our habit. Yay, we got a very specific test on how to fail. Now we can write some production code to make it pass. It's a minimal amount of production code, so we have a very short path to get there. And then all the tests are passing. And green tests passing are its own reward. Like everybody can clap. It's really easy to get a happy test or a happy reaction out of all tests passed. So that reward is almost automatic. The failing one takes a little bit more effort. And we just keep doing that. Lather, rinse, repeat. Let's just keep doing this. Fail, pass, fail, pass, fail, pass. We are building a bunch of cruft. Yes, we're building technical debt, but that's okay because chances are we're doing this with a toy problem that's not going to production. Chances are we're doing this with a piece of code that we can refactor later, and we now have a set of tests to make it work anyways. The tests show that it works, even if it's really, really crufty code. Even if we built up a huge amount of unmanaged technical debt there, we have tests to back it up. We have some freedom to refactor. This is the TDD focus loop. This is the way we learn fast habits around TDD for the very first side of it. But I haven't forgot about refactor. So before I go there, Steve, any questions in this space?
No, nothing.
Okay.
No questions that I can see.
Okay. Oh, and my diagrams have decided to do something weird, but that's okay. We'll work on that. So we get to the refactoring focus loop. And you notice that I've split out the pass into question mark here, because what I ask myself is what is the right cue and what is the right reward for these two sides of it? Because if we have an automatic refactoring, we're going to go right from pass to pass. But what is the reward? What is the thing that makes us go and refactor that again? What is the thing that actually drives us to refactor? So the good thing about building up a bunch of cruft at the previous TDD loop is we can always go back to that and use that to drive our refactoring later. We can get people sensitized to my code's crumbling, or things are difficult to change, or it's hard to add the next test. How can we make that easier? And we get to this point where we want to be able to do refactoring. So we start from a passing state. You notice I've actually flipped the two sides of it in this. It's going to make it easier to sew those two diagrams together later. But we go from passing to refactor the code. What is the cue for that? Well, the cue I'm using is, given all tests are passing and the code smells. So now I have a set of cognitive learning that I have to do. Do I understand code smells? How do I sensitize myself to code smells? Once I do that, then I can apply refactoring. So do I understand the mapping of refactoring to code smell? Those, again, are cognitive learnings that we can apply, but we learn them separately and we bring them into this domain. So we can have a lesson on that and then have a practice session where we go apply them. So the payoff is then the code makes more sense. My engineer brain looks at that and says, ah, it was difficult to read before and now I can read it. Oh, there's duplication before and now there's no duplication. Ah, I didn't understand what it was doing before and now it makes a heck of a lot more sense. It's less smelly. So that's the payoff for the refactoring, but I don't know that the tests are passing yet. So now given the code makes sense, when we run the tests, you notice I'm still using we here because of course we're pairing our model and we're giving each other feedback, then all the tests pass. So now I'm back to my happy path of whenever I deviate away from pass, I want to get back to pass. So we start to get this gravity well around pass, where pass becomes our center anchor for how we're, it's our stable state from which all things diverge, but they only diverge by one habit, and we have a returning habit that brings us back to it. So these complementary habits are pulling us away from stability and driving us back to stability. So how do we get good at things? How do we get the right cues? How do we get the right perception and set for code smells and refactoring? Well, it turns out that we already know how to do this pretty well. We need to do pattern matching, and we need to do rapid pattern matching. And I will point out that there's been some innovation in the space. Flashcards work. So does Sparodex. So Llewellyn, I don't know if he's done a presentation in this group or not on Sparodex. If not, I've included a link. We'll forward that on. The idea of quick categorization. So we're back to that idea of fast thinking. We want to do fast pattern matching on something. So at a glance, can we instantly tell whether something is a song sparrow or a house sparrow, knowing the characteristics? And can we go through that as rapidly as possible and build out our pattern recognition skills? So now that becomes an innate response whenever we see it. Like, hey, that's a really cool house sparrow. How did you know that? I just knew. It becomes an automatic habit. And that's how we create our refactoring pattern deviation. We create the code smells recognition, and that drives the habit to refactor code. So there's a fair amount of training and learning in that space. But the cool thing is that's an extensible habit. We could teach one and only one code smell and focus on it. We could teach two code smells, and we could have multiple code smells overlapping. Steve.
The prime example of that Llewellyn will do at conferences is a Sparrow deck on method length. And he will go through the process of the Sparrow deck, and by the end of it, you just look at code and go, too big, small, too big.
And the link I have does have a link to that deck too, by the way.
Awesome.
So yeah, that's exactly where I would expect to go. And so we can build these if you don't have them. They're actually fairly, they take a little bit of effort to create, but they're not that bad. And when you're done, you have a really good reusable resource for pattern matching. The interesting thing about this is now is you can have the same cue passing tests, but you have two different routines that you might follow, and you follow whichever habit happens to be stronger. So if you have a cue and you have routine A and routine B, which reward do you crave more? Which pattern is more to your liking at the moment? And this is a challenge for people who are trying to replace habits. Now, the nice thing about TDD is we actually, if we're in a TDD pure environment where we're like a dojo, we don't have to build out a competing habit there. But in the workplace, we do. We have to build out a competing habit. And the competing habit there fundamentally is, my tests are passing, what is the next thing I should do? The answer is, oh, I'm going to write more code. In fact, for them, it might not even be my tests are passing. It's, I have a keyboard in front of me. What am I going to do? I'm going to write more code. So we have to be able to build that habit. And part of the things that allow us to do this, one of the things they talk about in Doig's book is the best way to reinforce habits is to have a buddy. Pairing, mobbing, surprise. I started learning test-driven development by reading Kent Beck's book, his original test-driven development book, by example. And he talked about how he used his daughter to be his pair, to give him the feedback of whether he was building code. I was in a work environment. I didn't have a daughter that I could bring to work and work in code. But I had a coworker who knew nothing about TDD refactoring, or in fact, very little about the language we were using. And I sat him down and paired with him for 3 months. And when we were done, he knew how to pair in TDD and I knew how to pair in TDD. And every time I did the wrong thing and tried to write code without a test, he caught me and told me. And it was easy for him because he had no existing habit in that space. So when I told him what the rules were, he was able to automatically keep me honest. So there's some advantage there to naivety or to novice coders, because they actually have less to unlearn, and they can be a much better mirror and a much better supporting partner in some cases. So we can replace our existing habits, but we also then can create competing habits to build out a larger state machine. And this is where I talk about why I reverse those. Now I've got 2 different habits. I see the tests are passing. Do I feel the instinct to write a next test to get to the next piece of valuable feature? Or do I feel the instinct to refactor to build a more intelligible piece of code base to work from? And that might include making the code malleable enough that I can write the next test easily. That's one of the paths I might take. That's one of the reasons I might refactor. So now we've reintroduced that decision loop that we had in Red-Green-Refactor, but it's a habit. It's not a slow thinking process. It's a fast competition between 2 innate instincts. And that's what makes this approach valuable and a quicker way to really instill some habits, because we can teach each piece in isolation. We can focus on the things that matter, and then we can let those habits compete. And as an outside coach, I can see, hey, it looks like we don't have enough refactoring strength. Maybe we need to spend some more time in learning hour on building out our awareness of code smells. Or, hey, we noticed that the defect locality of some of those unit tests were a little weird. Maybe we can focus on that. We can bring those cognitive topics back in, and we fuel our practice sessions with the discussion sessions we have. And that's an engine. Between that, we now have the beginning of a plan, do, check, act loop, right? Or be able to reflect on what we do. We can try something new, experiment on it, see how that works, and modify our behavior accordingly. And I usually prefer a plan, do, share, act, but I'm good either way. And it turns out that then once we have that stability at the center, that passing case, we can now add on lots of habits. I have a lot of different reasons I refactor. My original joke on this was, I told somebody, my TDD state machine has 17 states. Turns out it only has a few states, but it has a couple arcs. And I made good on that. I'll show you at the very end. I actually sat down and every time I did something new, I wrote it down just on the back of a piece of paper to see what it would do. But now I can start to do, look, I'm going to refactor to introduce new abstraction. I'm going to refactor to reduce the duplication of concepts in my code. I'm going to refactor to make the next test easier to write. And I can teach each one of those in isolation with a group, or I can work on it myself for my own skill set. This gives me a really tight loop to build this. And that means I can just add yet another loop. Hey, what if I want to do CI pulls and commits? Hey, look, given all the tests are passing, when we pull from the trunk, then the code has the latest changes and conflicts. Given we have the latest code, when we resolve the conflicts and we run the tests, then all the tests pass. And we can work through all those pieces. And now I'm sure once I have this, I have to have a separate one for pushes. Right, so I'm pulling, I also need to push. Those things probably happen on different cues and different cadences. Sorry, same cue of pass, but different strengths of depending on the cadence. Usually for me, I start to build up anxiety when I've been going too long without a push or too long without a pull. And that means we can just start looping them in. And now if I have an ATDD loop, yes, I can absolutely loop an ATDD loop on this thing. So we can start to build some very complex state machines. And after a while, you can just really do everything. These are my quick notes of what I wrote down. And I have things like, hey, what if I wanted to TDD remove a behavior? What if I'm adding a large behavior and the test is too difficult? What happens if I want to add a little bit I want to reduce or increase the readability of the code, or I want to expose a modifiable surface. That's a name for refactoring that I have in terms of how do I actually make something easier, more malleable to extend, right? Usually that's not just necessarily bringing up a code interface, but maybe just a code seam that I can weave some tests into. So this was me for a couple of hours just writing it down. And I'm sure there are many, many more paths on this. And what it came to me eventually that there's probably no end to this. I have habits I don't even know, and they're probably waiting for me somewhere else. And I may have to compete with the ones that I do want. But this is where I go. So thanks for following me on this ride. If you're looking for me, I am on the Code Crafters session. You can catch me on the Slack. I'm also on the Software Crafters Slack. You find me hanging on the Code Retreat channel as I'm helping people all around the world run Code Retreats. I'm on Mastodon, and if you want to email me, email is available. So again, I'm typically working teams of coaches, doing technical and process work with organizations and teams. If you're looking to bring me on, usually I'm bringing other people with me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. That was great. There was very interesting chat discussion along the way, some highlighting topics, some minor distractions, but a lot of it was building on what you had. Matt, I'll put a link to the Crafter Slack here in a second. We're a little past the top of the hour. I'd like to open it up to Q&A. I'm here for a while longer, so any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and when you're called, take yourself off mute and let's play. So I know one of the things that folks talked about was practicing. And when you're practicing the loops that you very much brought up, learning and practicing is much more effective when you're with a pair or an ensemble, right?
Oh, absolutely. I actually prefer mobbing now. One of the things that I started doing pairing almost immediately after I started doing TDD, and it was exhausting. And we had to take very frequent and very deliberate breaks to make that work. But the thing that I was discovering was it also was very difficult to get people to pair with me, not just because of the time commitment, but also because it exposed the inner workings of our minds, and some people are not comfortable showing their homework.
Mm-hmm.
I had a coworker who very much just knew that he was, even though I'd worked with him for almost a decade, he's like, I can't code in front of you. He thought I was a better coder than he was. And so he like, I can't code in front of you. Like, no, you don't get to see all the mistakes I make. In fact, I recall he brought a piece of code to me once and said, what does this piece of code do? And I said, I was being clever. You should rewrite that.
Exactly. So when I
solo code. Yeah.
When I started my coaching career, I specialized in pair programming and working with groups into pair programming. I'd start off the session with asking people, so what are your concerns about pair programming? And people would come up with the usual ones, it's a waste of time, it's hard to coordinate schedule, we don't have a setup for it, I don't know how to do it, things like that. And one of the things that was almost always left out, but was always towards the top of the list is fear.
Yeah.
It's scary. It's, I wish I was paid the high price consultant that comes in, but I'm that consultant that comes in and is going to be working with folks. And it's like, well, I shouldn't make mistakes, should I? Well, I do. And I use Google to code. And, allowing yourself to break through those barriers and get beyond the fear is actually frees up yourself. And then you start going, Oh, I can admit I'm wrong.
Yeah. I think that again, yeah, our emotional state very much impacts that. It impacts the reward system too, right? So if we're talking about building habits, fear response and anxiety drive exactly the opposite response to what we're trying to get. And they end up, conflicting with the habits we're trying to build. So there's a huge amount of effort to try to build as we talk about psychological safety a lot, but it's difficult to manifest it.
Mm-hmm.
But really being able, especially as a coach, you are often being inflicted on a team. They didn't pay to bring you there. Somebody who pays their salaries did. Mm-hmm. And so creating that safe space and creating a welcoming environment and being vulnerable in front of them as a coach often is that icebreaker that needs to happen in order to bring them along on that journey. And I do really think, again, mobbing also really dilutes that. So anybody who's anxious, it's much easier. If they want to hide for a little while, they can. That's perfectly fine. If they need to step out for a while, that's perfectly okay. And of course, Mob Mentality podcast, Chris and Austin do a much better job of describing all these things than I will try to do in a minute response. But that, from a habit perspective, the emotional state is really important. Right. There is a portion of, we didn't talk about emotional development in here, but the psychological and emotional state of the coders influences how our bodies respond to that reward system. And if we're not getting that dose of endorphin, if we got something else blocking it, we're not going to form a good habit.
Yeah. So there's a question in there on how do you find a partner? And this person can't find anyone at work. Yes.
I find partners in the weirdest ways. So what there are plenty of forums out there where people are saying, hey, can we go code? I would say crafters, I see at least a request every other week where somebody's saying, hey, I'd love to code. And so part of it is, being comfortable with virtual, because almost the difficulty is locality, right? How do I find people that are near me to do this? Less likely. But the Pacific Northwest has a good dose of crafters. So there are people out there. It's just a matter of connecting to them. One of the things I've found is very useful to find people is actually not just the people I know, but they brought people in accidentally. So at least twice, people that I've tried to get into Code Retreats haven't shown up until they brought somebody else. And it turns out those people were people that looked for a coding partner. Mm-hmm. They didn't. So it was interesting because I actually had difficulty initially finding coding partners, but if you still one step, like the people I asked didn't do it, but the people that they asked suddenly wanted to. Mm-hmm. That was a surprise to me. I'm sure there's some relational psychologist who understands that much better again, but that's what I kept running into. It wasn't the people I asked, it was the people they asked who I ended up pairing with. Yeah. Well, or asking for a friend, or yeah, it ends up being a flavor of that. Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of ego, either conscious or subconscious, around work. You could be an architect, you could be a senior dev, and you're working with an intern, and the intern says, hey, anyone want to try pairing or ensemble? It's like, and some people are bringing up safe workspace. Easily there's that. I will freely admit right now that my blinders are so set in collaborative development, and I say collaborative meaning pairing or ensemble. I ditched my ego back in the early 2000s, and any code I write, hell, the code I wrote an hour ago, I think Amber and Jessica are here, code I wrote an hour ago is shit now, so let's go ahead and refactor it. To me, it's freeing to leave that ego at the door and just be able to play with code. Yeah, I agree. I actually think interns are a boon to our profession because, it actually provides psychological safety both ways. As a senior person, you work as an intern, your worst is still better than most of the things they've seen. They don't know they're seeing bad code, right? They're happy to plod along with you. The second thing is, when they come back, if they come back next year, they know more and they're very happy with everything you taught them, and you can keep going from there. If they don't come back, guess what? Your secrets are now safe with them. It's a problem. So for senior people, there's a lot of safety in interns as long as you can get them to volunteer for that space.
Well, and as a experienced dev with an intern, you get number one, or an insight into what's new and being taught in schools, as well as a refresher of those basic techniques that some of us learned. I'm not professionally trained as a developer, but that you learn in college that you might have forgotten. And hey, it's a reminder. Oh, this.
Yeah.
So it goes both ways in my book.
Yeah, I had an intern that brought me on. We did test-driven development of Game of Life in hardware on a field programmable gate array chip that he was familiar with. So I knew nothing about the chip and the hardware stack by itself, but I knew a lot about the development environment. And between the two of us, I learned something, he learned something.
Yeah.
That's great.
One thing that I should probably mention before I think we're down to 16 people really quick is next month we are going to have the mob mentality folks here. They are going to be doing essentially an Ask Me Anything. If I come into here really quick, it is, let's see here, Unleashing the Power of Mobbing. And it'll be a good talk. These guys are great. Austin and Chris are fantastic. And should be a great conversation. I'm not going to hang up the Zoom yet, but I just wanted to get that in place as a quick plug. To go back to the topic that we had, another question. Can't find a partner. There was that there. Next one is, how do you balance teaching TDD versus teaching a group to mob for the first time so you don't introduce too many habits at once?
I teach mobbing first. Because if you can't communicate, you can't collaborate. And so there's an aspect of that where you can have them code with their existing style, and you run into the challenges of, they may not be doing incremental code, they may not be doing refactoring, they may not be doing testing, but they all have an opinion. They all have an opinion where things go. And so just teaching them basic negotiation and being able to align with each other is much, much more valuable. And I found groups that learn that tend to carry it out of the practice forum too. So again, I always do these things at practice forums so that there's less pressure. If you try to do this with production code and you do something new behavior with the production code, again, you're back on that 3 axes and you haven't constrained them all. And now you've got people like, oh, I've got to get this thing delivered, but this person keeps wanting to do it a different way.
Yeah.
So I ran into the problem. A manager stopped me in the hallway. It's like, did you tell my people they could pair debug? I'm like, no. I told them they had to pair it in the dojo. It's like, well, they're telling me they want to pair debug. I'm like, okay, that sounds great. Why are you complaining to me? Right. They found value in it and brought it out. And I think that's one of the key things too, is I like creating things in an environment where there's the option to bring it out. Nobody should be forced to do TDD. Nobody should be forced to pair or mob. You should be provided an environment where you can taste test to your satisfaction. And if it turns out it's durian, feel free. If it turns out it's durian, then great, bring it along, right? Either way, right? If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. But what we find is then teams tend to get a momentum going and they self-select. And eventually, you see people like, yep, everybody's mobbing and I really don't want to. And that means I'm either going to find another team or I'm going to learn to mob.
Yeah. With me, that very first leap into a kata has it's hard to minimize the number of knobs I'm trying to turn.
Yep.
But what I try to do is I try to minimize the amount of emphasis I'm putting on some different things. And in some ways, introducing ensembling can be done and is done in the beginning, having a group chat. And
Yes.
we're talking as a group, we're collaborating as a group. And then, surprise, we've been ensembling. Huh, that's what a meeting is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. My original style of introducing test-driven development was I would have a whiteboard and I would implement FizzBuzz, but I required everybody to tell me what the next test was. We all had to predict everything. Like we just did it on, effectively on paper, right? No computer involved, but writing the test, writing the code, writing the test, writing the code, refactoring as we go.
Yep.
But everybody as a group was giving input. And so I was providing the TDD knowledge and priming people, but I was giving them the ability to steer. I'm like, okay, I have a choice. I can do A or to do B, right? They didn't have to know how to TDD. They just needed to be able to vote, right? And if they actually formed an opinion off that, great. And so that was, again, isolating the behavior side and putting it on me. And we got to the point where you could do it, do FizzBuzz rapid fire in front of a group in 15 minutes to isolate that, but show them a different behavior, how to mob, how to align with each other.
Yep. How to get consensus, how to, yeah.
Yep.
The other thing that I would bring into this discussion is in behavioral psychology, there's this thing called the learning performing distinction. And how I lead into that is who here types 200 words per minute? And no one here, I can safely say, can type 200 words a minute. However, we are all paid professional typists. And the learning performing distinction says that when you're performing, you don't learn very well. And when you're learning, you don't perform very well. The human brain, two different modes. And that really highlights, well, we type all day. Why don't we type 200 words a minute? Well, it's because we're in performing mode and we're not learning. But if I were to come and say, Cody, I would pay you $1 million if at the end of 30 days you could type 200 words a minute. Cody, what would you do? Take time off work, get a typing tutor, and be typing, practice.
I end this call right now and start doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that highlights the learning performing distinction. So when you're doing exercises, it's important to be in that practice space where it's safe to fail.
And that's where you have teams who have that 10% or 20% time during the week where they can spend on it. Some of them often spend it on product experiments rather than actually trying to improve their skills or focusing on their flow or their work tools. Or often what ends up happening is just they're behind on their goals, and so it eats their practice time. So even the organizations that ostensibly have practice time, maintaining that boundary and really protecting it is a really difficult endeavor, and good managers can do it. It's a constant battle.
Yeah. So Tammy Ernst has a good question. How do you handle when there are unknowns or complexity in the problem or technology?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons I like mobs. It's really hard to stump everybody. But there's two different things. So if I'm in the product domain, there's problems in the product domain. The good news is we're probably doing production work. And those are things that are, spike worthy or things where we agree to time box and work on an experiment for the product. And those tend to be longer cycles. I'll do the same thing though around tools and habit though. So if we find that there's a tool problem, like, hey, we don't know why our tests aren't automatically running. I usually ask the question, is this the most important thing we can do? And usually if it's something like that where it's friction to the process, we'll escalate that real quickly. Yeah, we can't run tests quickly right now. Let's fix that. And we'll time box it. Like, how long are we going to spend on it? Not how long do they think it'll take? How long are we willing to spend on it? and try to crunch at that problem. And it may involve a scatter gather. We may be doing Google searches in parallel. We may be doing that, but we agree that we're going to all do work on it. And we can work on it in whatever self-organized fashion we want to, and we're going to share the learning amongst us. And when we're done, at the end of the time box, we're going to decide what we need to do next. And maybe we resolve the problem, maybe we don't. I've had times where we've had, some fairly thorny things that required several different iterations.
Mhm.
If it's a habit loop, I actually do something different. I'm like, okay, what exercise do we need to pivot to?
Yep.
I time box it, but I'm like, okay, it's clear we're having real trouble pulling from the trunk. Why we haven't pulled from the trunk in 3 hours? What's going on? Okay.
Mhm.
Let's figure out what that is. And the last time we committed, we had 17 conflicts. So we know that's an issue. So what do we do? Okay, what's the pivot exercise that we can do to learn integration?
Yep.
So for that's where you got to build your coaching toolbox as well. For the habit side of it. But the technology one, like I said, wisdom of the crowd works really well. If we weren't experts before, turning a group of engineers on a common goal with a short time frame is magic.
Mhm. So one of the things that I like with the complexity, or so if it's a problem with tech, doing tracer bullets, doing time boxing, spikes, very short time frames. One of the phrases that I use the most is, what's the simplest possible thing that we can do
Yes.
to fill in the blank, to prove this out, and try and keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And for things like training myself to commit after every green, or commit and work in small 2-minute segments and try and get my commits into 2 minutes, I will write programs or find things that will allow me to practice that would say, you know what, my code's going to revert in 2 minutes, regardless of what I'm doing. If I haven't committed, it's going to revert.
Yeah, we didn't show behavioral loops for baby steps or test commit and revert.
Yep.
or revert. It'd be fun to kind of play with that a little bit.
Yeah.
I figured we were going deep enough on TDD. We didn't have time for TCR.
Mhm.
But the other thing in that space, I think, is you really point out. So with being able to understand how long we're going to spend on something, what's the simplest thing we can do? One of the places where this falls down most often is debug. And we find this with teams, especially when we're working with things. If they have an integrated system where they have very, very tightly coupled code and very, very large, maybe they're running integration tests or tests of this, their feedback loops are extremely, extremely large.
Yep.
And debug in that space is an unbounded effort, because that skill, there's both a cognitive and a behavioral thing there about how to time box and how to figure out the smallest thing you can do, is missing. And I find that is the time sink that most teams do. They've gotten into the test later or test never, and debug starts to eat their time. And in fact, flaky tests are a flavor of debug time that gets eaten. The first team I was ever Scrum Master for, we had a meeting after I abandoned my Scrum Master post and said, okay, I'm back to being a senior engineer with the team. Where are we spending our time? It's asking a Scrum Master question, of course.
Yep.
We spend 2 days a week on debugging flaky tests.
Mhm.
Okay, let's spend a week. Spend a week fixing the tests. But we can't do that.
Yeah.
We can. Yeah.
Yep. And that's a very interesting point about debug, is the more proficient I got, and when I mastered and became very proficient with TDD, the less time I spent debugging.
Yes.
And for a while, I was taking polls with people, and most people that don't do TDD spend about 50%, if not more, of their time actually debugging their code. I can say that I spend easily less than 5%, probably more like 2% of my code time debugging code. That's why you get a productivity boost writing tests.
Yeah. Wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
And if it isn't tested, you have to assume it's broken.
Yeah.
That's courtesy of Bob Colwell, former senior fellow at Intel.
Awesome. Good questions, good talks. What other stuff we got? Matt, we got some stuff in here. Significant barrier is psychological safety. This is a great statement. I think it's very easy for us white guys to talk about how safe we feel to be vulnerable at work. We need to remember the power dynamics are a thing. And number one, I'm not a white guy, but I am a guy. And so I completely agree that I'm sitting here coming from a position of privilege, talking about how easy it could be to talk about psych safety. And that is a hard thing. And giving that space and making a safe space is one of the things that I really strive for.
Yeah. As I said, you noticed my first tale was this person wouldn't pair with me because of the lack of psychological safety.
Yep.
And so I think, tales like that help illustrate it. So that's one of the things I used to diffuse. One of my other favorite talks and or favorite stories is I had probably my second or third code retreat I ran in Portland. We had an all male cast with the exception of one woman. And brave soul came in, worked everything. And when we got to a retrospective at the end of the day, we had done a full 6 iterations. She said, I learned something amazing. I learned that you guys suck just as much as I do. It's like, again, that perception about everybody being better because we don't only see the final result. We only see, I'm going to protect my work until I publish it. And so I think one of the challenges is, bring those tales forward and remind everybody that, it's okay. It's okay to show it, but 2, then trying to figure out, how do we elevate the voices?
Mm-hmm.
We end up with, we're lucky if we get a few more facilitators that are able to build that. If we're even luckier, those facilitators don't fit the majority demographic.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen some experiments. Portland, for a while, we had a women-focused code retreat. That was pre-COVID times, and we've done some experiments with virtual. There's been some, just having some conversation about the Calgary Crafters group. They talked about how they did an event over multiple days. We're just doing like 1 hour a day during the week, and that provided freedom for people who didn't have the schedule availability that people who either weren't married or didn't have children or had more mobility. That making that virtual and making that spread out gave them that accessibility. And so looking for those affordances that we can make to bring more people on board. Some of these things are going back to live now. We're kind of losing some aspect of that. There are people who are going to be shut out because they live in a different state, or they.
Well, and that really highlights this meetup. This meetup used to only be in person, 7 o'clock at night in Seattle, and we had pizza and beer, which was awesome, and I like that. However, now that we're at 10 a.m. Pacific time and completely virtual, we have people from around the world. We've got Raul, who's coming in from India. I know Amber is Central Time, maybe Eastern. I think she's Central Time.
I'm in Detroit.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Detroit is good. I did an IL gig there.
Yeah, and so we're getting people from around the world more easily accessible. Yeah. Matt, do you have anything else to add to that?
I would just invite anyone else to share a story. If there's somebody who would like to share something in that space, I told you my tales. I'm sure you have some of your own.
I have this memory of going into a place when I was like very new at doing consulting stuff, and I was very excited about coding dojos, and I'd been going to a coding dojo in London, and I went to this company in Ireland somewhere, and I'd had like an hour with them or something, and I was like, right, okay, so now we're going to do a little exercise, and there's 10, 12 people in the room, and I invited 2 of them to come up to start coding on the keyboard, and it was just tumbleweeds. Like nobody dared to do it in front of everybody else. And so this, like, it was a real lesson for me about the assumptions that you can make about, just because you feel safe to do that doesn't mean everybody else does. And I think just the fact that you're employed as somebody who does that kind of work, right, where you go in and make those kinds of interventions in teams, you're automatically coming in with some power in that environment. And actually what you need to do is kind of think about who's maybe not right at the bottom end of the power dynamic, but like, who are the people in the room who are going to be the most afraid, and what kind of an environment do you need to create for them to be able to flourish, and then everybody else will be fine.
Mm-hmm. You know, so when I'm coaching a code retreat or a kata culture session, or, you know, in a meetup and we're doing ensemble work, you know, our people are paired up, I'm actually very cognizant of coach. So I'm a relatively big guy. I'm 6 foot. I've got big stature. I've got a loud projecting voice. And when I'm going to talk to someone, I will kneel. So I am down underneath their height, talking with them. And I bring my tone down to quiet, to have the private conversation with them. And there are a lot of things that I've had to learn, and I'm still learning. I'm nowhere near perfect. I'm always learning, picking up things that help disarm me as that type of person. There was another guy I worked with, a guy named Mickey Phoenix, easily one of the most intelligent developers I worked with. He's huge. He was 6'8". He had some back surgery. He grew an inch and started hitting his head on door frames, 6'9". Huge, big, imposing guy, 350 pounds, really big. This guy could write books on how to disarm his look and his feel to seem like he's there to very much help you and not to be intimidated by him. It was wonderful to see some of that, and I value that learning that I got from Mickey. Yeah. George.
I just wanted to say that the safety to be vulnerable, in my opinion, gets better when you get older. And I've always had this opinion that almost everybody I meet knows something better than I do.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're constantly looking at it from the perspective of everybody can teach you something.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it when you look at that and you start asking them questions about, you know, what do they like to do and all this jazz, and then inevitably they have some shared interest. And I find that it basically opens up the, you know, at least I think it lowers my intimidation level. But you know, it's hard to measure your own level of intimidation.
Yeah. No, it's all good. It's fantastic. You know, one of the other techniques that I use is some self-deprecating stories or talking about things. In fact, one of my things that's really up front in my mind, if I'm in pairing with someone or working with an ensemble, is how quickly can I find an excuse to either make a mistake in code, not to make myself look like a buffoon, but make a mistake in code that someone can correct me, or that we need to go to Google for, to show I don't know everything. Does anyone know the answer to that? I've got a great self-deprecating story about writing code with this guy that I was pairing with for the first time at Solutions IQ. I forget his name. He had a very strong Russian accent. I'm going to do this Russian accent horribly, but he was like, we were looking at some code and he's like, look at this code. Who wrote this code? This code is crap. And I said, that was me. And he's like, oh, well, we can make it better. And it's like, okay, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I find there's a lot of, and coaching our word choices become extremely important. That's a whole other different discussion, but yeah, the code is good, but it could be better, as opposed to this sucks and it could be better.
Well, and falling back on review the code, not the person.
Yes.
That's a
So-
life lesson for ensemble and collaborative programming.
That goes back to psychological safety. One of the first things I did my first Code Dojo, I did almost by accident. I put rules in place. I actually had a posted set of rules in the beginning, rather than, you know, I was sort of a benevolent dictator in that space because I was doing it for the first time and I was trying to get people in there. So I wrote the rules rather than consensus working agreements. But there were things like nobody codes alone, no code enters, no code leaves.
Mhm.
So we don't bring any code in, and anything we do here, we don't take it out. So nobody, you can delete your code, nobody can see it, right? But things like that, and those gave that safety. And one of the things was one of the rules was something called the Jeopardy rule, which is question code, don't criticize it. And it's very simple: is can you rephrase that criticism in the form of an open-ended question?
Yep.
Not
Jeopardy
that code sucks, doesn't it? But what trade-off do we make, you know, when we were building this? So what concerns do we have? Right? Things like that, where you can actually explore the dynamic and gain understanding rather than taking up a side in the debate.
Mhm. Most of the time, all code written was written to the best of that person or that ensemble's ability at that time.
Yeah, respect for the past is actually kind of nice, right? And the idea that we acknowledge that whoever did this, exactly that, they did their best effort and they did it under conditions or circumstances which we were not privy to.
Yep. Yeah.
Also, every once in a while, I run the Git blame tool and it's me.
all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Who wrote this?
Why
Well,
is
there
this
were
method so
only
long?
3 coders on this project, so roll the dice.
Yeah. And that brings up, so XP has the 5 values. I like to say that, I humbly say that there's a 6th value, humility, that should be added in. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of questions, and chat has wound down. We're at 11:45 Pacific time. I'm going to go ahead and close this unless anyone else has any more quick questions they want to throw in. Going once, twice.
Quick,
Sold.
yes. Quick thank you, everybody, for participating in the discussion and listening. This is the first time I presented this in this format, and I'm going to keep revising it, so all feedback is welcome. This is not the final form by all means, and there's plenty of work I can do to help. Anyone who can help me out by kind words or sharp criticism is welcome to do so.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone that even stuck around all the way through this. I appreciate it. We will be having next month, we'll be having Chris and Austin from Mob Mentality coming and talk. Should be a great show. Great crafter meetup, and we'll see you then.